In the heart of a stormy Oregon forest, a battle-scarred veteran heard a sound that changed everything. A faint whimper beneath the rain. What he found weren't soldiers, but two tiny German shepherd puppies chained to a message no longer of value. But what if those abandoned lives carried a secret one that would unravel a dark past and ignite a journey of healing neither man nor dog saw coming? What were they running from, and why were they chosen to lead the way back? The rain had not let up all day, thick, unrelenting, and heavy with the kind of weight that soaked deeper than skin, the kind that clung to the bones and whispered memories from another life. Luke sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, the windshield wipers sweeping rhythmically like a ticking clock that no longer marked time, but kept a pulse over the silence he had learned to live with. Outside, the road had become a mess of mud and shadow winding through the dense forest like a vein through something ancient and breathing. He had driven this path countless times before, each turn familiar, each pothole memorized by muscle memory. The rutted trail led away from the whispering edge of civilization, cutting deep into the green tangle where Luke had chosen to live alone, a place where voices didn't chase him and ghosts rarely found him. The engine grumbled beneath him, tired like its owner, yet still determined to press forward until a sudden groan and a lurch halted its progress. The tires spun, kicked up wet earth, and then sank with a slow final sigh. Luke killed the engine. A soft curse slipped past his lips, more breath than sound. Rain hammered the roof of the truck in steady percussion, and for a moment, that was all just water and mud and the stillness of a man caught in a moment he didn't want. And then it came. So faint at first, he thought it was a trick of the forest, a high-pitched whimper, thin, uncertain, more like a feeling than a sound. His heart paused, caught between instinct and disbelief. The second time it came, he was already reaching for the flashlight beneath the seat, already pulling his jacket collar up against the downpour. He stepped out of the truck and immediately sank ankle-deep into the thick sludge. But he barely noticed. His boots moved with the confidence of someone who had once learned to walk through war zones, who had memorized how to listen for things others dismissed. The flashlight cut a narrow beam through the soaked underbrush, and with each step forward, the whimper returned clearer, now desperate, trembling with life hanging by a thread. The trees loomed tall and heavy with moss, their limbs like fingers grasping for sky. Luke pushed through wet branches, the cold sliding beneath his clothes. But something in his chest had begun to burn, a tension that pulled him forward faster, deeper into the thicket. Then the light froze. There, beneath the drooping canopy of ferns, and behind a fallen log, wrapped in ivy and rot, were two small figures. At first, they didn't move. The beam of the flashlight rested on matted fur, mud-caked paws, and the thin, trembling shapes of two tiny puppies. German shepherds, maybe 3 months old at most, their ribs visible even through the wet mess of their coats. One lay curled tightly unmoving, but breathing, while the other tried weakly to lift its head at the sound of footsteps. Its eyes were glassy, but somewhere in them, a flicker of hope clung like breath on a mirror. They were chained. Heavy, rusted chains looped cruelly around their tiny necks, the metal cutting into damp fur, the links tethered to a rotting log, as if they were objects, not lives. And just beside them, partially buried under fallen leaves and drenched cardboard, was a piece of handwritten cruelty, 4 words scrawled in thick black ink now running in the rain. No longer of value. For a moment, Luke didn't breathe. The sight, the words, the soaked stillness, it carved into something old inside him, something he thought he had locked away in silence. But now, it rose hot and bitter, like the ghost of something lost too many years ago. Without a word, he turned and trudged back to the truck, the mud sucking at his boots. From the battered toolbox in the bed, he pulled out a pair of bolt cutters, their handles cold and worn from time and use. By the time he reached the log again, rain poured down in silver sheets running into his collar, sliding over his hands. He didn't speak to the pups, not yet. His hands moved with quiet urgency. The first chain snapped with a loud metallic crack, the sound sharp against the hush of the forest. The puppy flinched, but didn't run. The second chain followed a dull echo through the trees. The puppies were so light when he lifted them, barely more than bundles of wet fur and shivering bones. The smaller one nestled closer, as if instinctively drawn to the warmth of his chest. The other rested its chin on his arm, eyes fluttering closed in exhaustion. He held them both, one in each arm, and walked slowly, carefully back through the underbrush toward the waiting warmth of the cabin. It was a long walk, made slower by the weight of emotion more than the load itself. The rain didn't let up. But as the porch light of his cabin flickered through the trees, something inside Luke shifted a pull toward something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose fragile but forming. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of cedar smoke and old paper. The fire had been dying, but he stoked it back to life with practiced hands, the orange glow stretching across the worn floorboards and the soft rug by the hearth. He laid the puppies down on the fabric gently, one beside the other. Their tiny bodies didn't resist. They lay still, breathing shallow but steady, the mud already beginning to dry into patches on their fur. Luke moved with quiet focus. He found clean towels and warm water, and one by one began wiping them down his hands, slow and careful. He whispered once, unintentionally, as he brushed a clump of leaves from behind one floppy ear. "You're safe now." The fireplace hissed as new logs caught flame. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside the world became smaller. Just Luke and two small creatures who had been thrown away, who had somehow survived long enough to be found. When he returned with a shallow bowl of diluted broth, one puppy stirred. The bigger one first, its nose twitching slightly before its pink tongue flicked out to lap at the warmth. Luke held the bowl in place. The other pup opened its eyes, one brown, one pale amber, and after a moment of hesitation, drank too slow and unsure. He watched them still crouched on the rug, and the names came to him like memories from a dream. The quieter one, the pale one with that flickering look of retreat in his eyes, he was Flicker, like the last glow of a candle refusing to go out. The darker one, with cautious strength even in stillness, he would be Ash, like something that had burned but still held warmth at its center. Ash curled his body instinctively between the fire and Flicker, as though shielding the smaller pup. Luke leaned back on his heels, the towel still in his lap, watching them slowly surrender to the pull of warmth and safety. And somewhere inside him, where grief had long since turned to silence, a new kind of quiet began to bloom, one not made of sorrow, but of stillness that weights of space held open for something gentle to take root. Outside the forest exhaled under the weight of rain. But inside the cabin, under the soft orange glow of firelight, two tiny chests rose and fell, and the man who had once chosen solitude above all else felt something stir. Something fragile and new. Something that would not be ignored. The fire popped again, a sharp crackle that made Flicker twitch in his sleep. Tiny paws flexing. Luke didn't move. He simply watched. Not as a soldier, not as a man running from memories, but as someone beginning to remember how it felt to sit beside life that needed you not because you were strong, but because you had stayed. And in the flickering warmth, as the storm outside raged without invitation, Luke didn't know yet that this moment, this quiet moment, was the beginning of everything that would follow. He only knew that he wasn't alone anymore. And just as he closed his eyes, one question bloomed quietly at the edge of thought. Where had they come from? And who had chained them to die? The cabin had grown warmer through the night. The fire a steady breath in the hearth, crackling softly with the rhythm of old pine logs. Outside, the rain continued its mournful descent, sliding down the window panes in slow-moving rivers that caught the morning light in streaks of silver and shadow. But inside, a new kind of quiet had taken root, one not built from loneliness, but from fragile trust and the first breath of safety. Luke moved slowly, his body heavy from the restless night, but his hands steady with purpose. The two puppies still lay curled on the thick rug before the fire, their chests rising and falling in shallow rhythmic motions, their small bodies pressed close together like pieces of a puzzle that only made sense side by side. He crouched beside them, with a fresh towel in one hand and a bowl of warm water in the other. One of the puppies, smaller with a pale cream coat now mostly free of mud, twitched gently in its sleep, letting out a soft sound somewhere between a sigh and a squeak. Luke smiled the curve of his mouth, faint but real. One at a time he began again, dipping the towel, wringing it out, and gently working over their paws behind their ears under their chins, where the fur was still damp and cool to the touch. The bigger of the two, darker in color with streaks of smoky gray across his back, barely stirred, only opened one eye occasionally to track Luke's movements, not in fear, but with something guarded, observant. That one would need time. Not the kind of time you could measure in days or meals, but the kind that had to be earned in silence, with presence, with the slow weight of kindness. Luke didn't speak much as he worked. Words had become sparse in his life, not absent, but saved for moments that mattered. And this somehow already did. When he had finished drying them, he brought out a small pot, filled it with warm water and a spoonful of soft rice porridge he had kept in the cupboard. He let it simmer gently while the fire whispered behind him, the scent of wood smoke curling into the room like a memory. He poured the mixture into a wide, shallow bowl and carried it over. As he knelt beside them, one of the puppies stirred again, eyes half open, nose twitching toward the scent. Luke slid the bowl forward a few inches and waited. The cream-colored pup, the smaller one, sat up with some effort, his legs shaky beneath him, ears drooping like wet petals. He took a tentative step toward the bowl, paused, then backed up slightly. His gaze flicked from the bowl to Luke and then to the fire, and it was then the logs shifted in the hearth. A sudden pop, sharp and dry wood snapping with the heat. The puppy startled violently. His entire body recoiled. He skittered back across the rug, eyes wide, trembling from the tips of his ears to the pads of his feet. It wasn't just fear, it was the kind of recoil that came from memory, from a sound etched somewhere too deep to be forgotten. Luke froze. He didn't reach out, didn't speak. He simply sat there watching as the pup tried to disappear into the folds of the rug, ears, flat eyes, darting. After a moment, the darker one, the larger pup, lifted his head. His ears turned first toward the fireplace, then toward the smaller pup. He stood slow and deliberate and moved in between, placing his body like a barrier, like a quiet wall of reassurance. Luke's breath caught. He had seen gestures like that before, not just in dogs, but in men. The way one soldier would step in front of another. The way protection didn't have to be loud or forced. It just was. He sat back slightly, his knees creaking, and looked at them again, two small lives already holding each other, up in a world that had shown them its sharpest edge far too early. He murmured then, his voice low, barely more than a thought-given sound. "You're a flicker," he said softly to the pale one, who now peeked out from behind the other side, like a little flame trying to stay lit. The name wrapped itself around the moment like a blanket. Flicker. And to the other, the one who stood like shadow against the firelight, silent and steady. "You're Ash," Luke said the word soft but certain. Not what was burned, but what remains. Ash didn't react outwardly. He didn't wag his tail or make a sound. But he stood his ground, his body still between Flicker and the fire eyes, watching Luke in that same deep, unreadable way. Luke stayed with them until the tension in Flicker's limbs eased. Eventually, Ash lay back down, and only then did Flicker inch toward the bowl. He sniffed, then licked at the broth, hesitant at first, then with more certainty. Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were eating. They were here. He rose slowly, letting them be, and moved to the old rocking chair by the fire. He sat down, his body heavy in a familiar way, but his mind oddly awake, alert in places that had long gone quiet. The names repeated in his head. Flicker, Ash. They weren't just names. They were truths, tiny signals in the dark. He watched as the two pups curled back together once more, their bellies full for the first time in who knows how long. Flicker's nose pressed against Ash's flank, and Ash rested his chin over Flicker's back like a guardian who had always known how to carry more than his share. Luke reached for the old wool blanket that hung over the chair and laid it gently over both of them, tucking the edges just enough to trap the heat from the fire. As he stood again, stretching his limbs and feeling the deep ache that came from both body and heart, he glanced toward the small window above the kitchen sink. The rain had slowed, tapering into mist, soft and silver in the light of the late morning. The day felt different. Not brighter, not lighter, but warmer. In a way that came not from sunshine, but from something beginning to return. A rhythm, a pulse, a reason to move, to watch, to wait. Ash shifted slightly in his sleep. Flicker let out a soft breath, tiny paws twitching once like running in a dream. Luke smiled again, faint but steady. He didn't know what these two had survived. He didn't know who had tied them to that log or how long they had waited. But he knew this: they had names now, and names he believed were promises. Outside, the clouds pulled apart slowly, revealing the first thread of pale blue sky. A single beam of sunlight broke through and touched the edge of the porch, where a small trail of paw prints still marked the mud. Luke watched it, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then slowly, he walked back to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the cool, damp morning boots, pressing into soft earth, heart moving toward the next quiet question that had begun to rise. Where had Ash and Flicker come from? And more importantly, why had someone gone through the trouble to leave them behind so deliberately, yet leave them alive? The morning air was crisp, brushed with the lingering scent of pine and the gentle hush of waves drifting up from the coastline below. The rain had passed sometime during the night, leaving the world glistening in its wake. Droplets clung to every leaf, every blade of grass turning the forest into a mosaic of silver light and trembling green. The cabin, usually so still, was filled with the soft sounds of paws shifting on floorboards, bowls clinking faintly against wood, and the occasional creak of Luke moving about with a kind of attentiveness he hadn't practiced in years. Ash and Flicker were awake early, though their bodies were still thin, still fragile from whatever they had endured. Something in their movement had changed overnight. Flicker's tail gave a cautious twitch when Luke refilled the water bowl, and as Ash stood straighter, eyes alert, ears turning slightly at every distant sound through the open window. Luke had barely slept. Not from worry, but from watching. He had sat beside the fireplace with a pen in hand and an old notebook he rarely used anymore. Something he used to carry on deployments pages, now filled with notes on weather coordinates, memories too quiet to be spoken aloud. This time, though, he had written down two names at the top of a new page: Flicker, Ash. And beneath them, a question that kept rising, no matter how he pushed it away. Who would train pups like these, and then discard them like nothing? By mid-morning, he had wrapped Flicker in an old towel and tucked him gently into the passenger seat of his truck. Ash climbed in without hesitation, settling on the floorboard at Luke's feet. The vet's office was nearly an hour away in a small coastal town called Fair Harbor, where the scent of salt lingered in every crack of wood and window pane, and the gulls cried like old secrets carried on the wind. The building was modest whitewashed walls, green trim, and a hand-painted sign that simply read, Clara Voss DVM. A small ceramic figurine of a shepherd dog sat on the porch railing, its glaze chipped at the ear. Luke parked in the gravel lot, stepped out into the breeze, and opened the door slowly. "You remember Clara?" he said softly, glancing down at Ash, who looked up at him with unreadable calm. "She's a good one." The bell above the door chimed gently as they entered. The waiting room smelled of eucalyptus and clean linen, with a row of faded chairs, a woven rug, and a corkboard filled with photos of animals and handwritten thank you notes. Behind the reception counter stood a woman in her 50s with short, practical silver hair and eyes sharp enough to see through walls. She glanced up, her expression neutral at first until she saw Luke. Then her face softened into something between surprise and relief. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "Luke Maddox." Luke gave a small nod. "Clara. And you brought company." He glanced down. Ash had stepped just inside the door. Body still gazed steady. Flicker, wrapped in the towel and pressed close against Luke's chest, peeked out with cautious curiosity. Clara didn't move closer. She knelt instead just a little, offering her open palm. "You've got good eyes," she said, not to Luke, but to Ash. Ash didn't respond immediately, but his ears didn't flatten and he didn't shrink back. That was enough. Clara stood. "Come on, let's get them inside." The exam room was quiet and warm. Soft light filtered through the curtain window, falling over the stainless steel table, and a shelf filled with well-worn books. Clara moved with the calm precision of someone who had seen injury in both humans and animals, who had stitched up wounds that didn't always bleed. She gestured for Luke to place Flicker on the table first. The little pup trembled slightly, but allowed it. Clara worked slowly, her fingers steady, as she checked his heartbeat, his joints, the back of his throat. She made no sounds of pity, only brief, quiet notes under her breath. When she finished, she looked at Luke. He's underweight, might have parasites, but he's resilient. She nodded toward Flicker. That spark in his eyes, that's real. Luke said nothing. Just reached down and gently stroked behind Flicker's ear where the fur was growing in softer. Then came Ash. Clara didn't ask him to climb up. She simply knelt beside him, resting one hand on her knee, waiting. Ash moved toward her, not with excitement, but with intent. She reached out, brushed her hand along his back, and slowly lifted one ear to check for mites. And then she stopped. Her breath caught, barely audible, but Luke noticed. She leaned in closer, folding the edge of Ash's ear delicately between her fingers. "What is it?" Luke asked, stepping forward. Clara's voice, when it came, was steady, but something in her tone had shifted. "Look here," she said gently, turning Ash's head toward the light. Luke moved beside her, and that's when he saw it. Barely visible under the thin layer of fur, faded and nearly dissolved by time and weather, was a sequence of letters and numbers, blurry, small, but unmistakably deliberate. Ink. A tattoo. Not decorative, not accidental. An identification marker. Clara looked up at Luke, her expression tight with something far heavier than surprise. "This isn't a breeder's tag," she said. "It's a unit code." Luke felt his stomach turn. "You're sure?" Clara nodded. Back in Iraq, some units used to mark trained canines under the skin, just in case tags were lost or collars removed. Contractors used them too, especially private outfits. Quiet ones. Luke reached into his back pocket, pulled out his phone, and carefully snapped a photo of the code. His fingers hovered over the image for a long moment. "Do you know who used this format?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "I've got guesses, but I know someone who can give you answers." Luke stared at the photo again. The numbers blurred slightly in the reflection of his screen, but the weight of them was sharp enough. He stepped outside after they finished holding the pups close as the ocean breeze rose from the bluffs. Clara followed him to the porch. "I'll run blood work," she said. "Check for anything deeper. But if I'm right, Luke, these weren't pets." "Not at first." He nodded once. I'll find out. She rested a hand on the doorframe. Be careful where you go looking. Some places don't want to be found. Back in the truck, Ash settled again by Luke's boots. Flicker was already asleep, curled tight under his blanket. Luke stared at the dashboard for a long minute. Then, he scrolled through his contacts, paused over a name, and pressed call. It rang only once. A gruff voice answered. Briggs. Luke didn't hesitate. I need your help. There was a pause. Then, talk to me. Luke sent the photo. Look familiar? It took a moment. Then Briggs replied, That's Redline K9. Luke didn't speak. Briggs continued, private security contractor. Supposed to have shut down 2 years ago after allegations of misconduct. Quiet settlement. Records sealed. But I remember that code. They used it for dogs undergoing aggressive tactical conditioning. Mostly pups. High-risk stuff, not military standard. Luke closed his eyes. So they trained them. Broke them. Briggs exhaled, and then vanished. Some say they sold off the ones that didn't pass. A gust of wind blew through the trees. Luke looked down at Ash and Flicker, now fast asleep together, noses touching tails, faintly flicking. They're not gone, he said quietly. 2 of them ended up in my woods. Briggs was silent for a moment. Then softly, I hope you're ready for this. Luke ended the call and placed the phone on the dashboard. He didn't answer. He just started the engine, the old truck rumbling back to life, as the wind carried the scent of salt and old truths through the cracked window. And behind his steady hands on the wheel, a single thought burned with sudden clarity. Who else did they leave behind? And if Ash and Flicker were still alive? What were they running from? The forest that afternoon wore its grayness like a heavy cloak, every pine branch bending slightly with the weight of an overcast sky. Light filtered in thinly, as if hesitant to touch the ground, and the damp air clung to Luke's skin as he moved along the narrow trail behind the cabin. The scent of wet moss and old earth filled his lungs, and the crunch of his boots against fallen leaves echoed softly in the stillness. Beside him, Ash and Flicker trotted in quiet tandem, no longer dragging their paws with weakness, but not yet running with freedom either. Their steps were cautious, guided more by something instinctual than by play. They had chosen this path. It wasn't the one Luke usually took, the familiar loop that wound through tall ferns and back to the meadow. But something else. Something hidden behind thick underbrush and the silence of long-forgotten things. Flicker had paused, first ears twitching nose high in the wind. Then Ash had followed, stepping deliberately through the grass, gaze fixed ahead as if drawn by memory. Luke trusted their pull. They had come from something shadowed, something deeper than abandonment, and if this was a thread leading back to it, then he would follow it, even if the road twisted into places he'd rather not walk. The trail narrowed, flanked by wild raspberry thickets and long tendrils of fern. He ducked beneath low branches and pushed aside a curtain of ivy, the forest slowly folding around him like a quiet breath held too long. Ash stopped suddenly, his ears flattened but not in fear, more like recognition. And then Luke saw it. Hidden behind a veil of green and rot stood a rusted trailer, its frame sagging, its once white paint now streaked with mildew and rust. Windows were clouded, their corners webbed with grime and age. The tires had long since surrendered to the soil, swallowed by time and roots. Nature had tried its best to reclaim it, but something about it resisted, like a scar, refusing to fade. Luke's body tensed. He raised a hand, signaling both pups to stay. Ash obeyed immediately, standing tall, but still his eyes narrowed. Flicker let out a small whine, shifting from paw to paw, uneasy. Luke approached the trailer slowly, every step measured. His hand rested near his belt out of habit rather than need. He paused at the base of the crumbling steps, peered through the mottled window, and then called out his voice, calm but clear. "Hello?" No answer. He stepped closer, boots creaking against rusted metal. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness inside thick and unmoving. He reached out fingers, brushing the cold handle, and pushed. The smell hit first. Stale air, sickness, damp cloth, and something faintly metallic like dried blood and old pain. He moved carefully into the gloom, his eyes adjusting to the dim. Shapes resolved slowly, a battered mattress on the floor, a tipped-over crate, a rusted propane burner untouched for weeks. And on the mattress, curled up under a tattered blanket, lay a man. His skin was pale, his face gaunt and lined with exhaustion. One arm was wrapped in a blood-stained rag that looked like it had been torn from a jacket. His lips were cracked, and his eyes blinked open only as Luke stepped into the light. Don't come closer," the man rasped, voice hoarse with dehydration and fear. Luke raised his hands, palms forward. "I'm not here to hurt you." The man squinted. They sent you." "No," Luke said gently. "I found 2 pups. They led me here." At that, something broke in the man's face. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and then a whisper tumbled from his lips, soft, disbelieving. "Ash." In the next breath, the door behind Luke creaked again. Ash pushed past him silently, followed by Flicker, both moving toward the mattress with a slowness that felt like reverence. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. Ash approached the man's side, sniffed once, and gently nudged the man's hand with his nose. Flicker placed his head beside the man's uninjured arm and lay down, eyes half closed. Tears welled in the man's eyes, and his hand trembled as it moved toward Ash's head. He stroked the fur lightly, as if afraid it might disappear. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "I thought they'd find you." Luke stepped closer, now his voice soft but firm. "Who are you?" The man blinked up at him. "Min," he said. "My name is Min. I was one of the handlers." Redline. Luke sat on the overturned crate, elbows on his knees, eyes never leaving Min's. "Redline's shut down," he said. Min gave a bitter, broken laugh. "That's what they want everyone to think. Officially, it's gone. But they just moved operations deeper into the woods. Smaller numbers, less oversight, no one watching anymore." Luke's jaw tightened. "The dogs. Still there?" Min nodded slowly. The ones who passed their training and the ones who didn't. They were discarded. Or worse. He shifted, grimacing as pain lanced through his arm. "I tried to stop them," he said. "Gather evidence, photos, names. But they found out. Beat me half to death. Left me here. Thought I'd die before anyone came." Luke looked down at Ash and Flicker, curled protectively at Min's side. "You saved them," Min's voice cracked. "I chained them near the road. Put that note no longer of value, to make them think I followed orders. It was the only way. I couldn't carry them. I could barely walk. But I had to try." Luke was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you have proof? Anything that points to where they are?" Min nodded slowly. With great effort, he reached beneath the thin mattress and pulled out a folded, grimy piece of paper. Luke took it and carefully opened it. It was a hand-drawn map. Rough but detailed markings of trees, rock formations, a ridge-line coordinates scribbled in the corner. An X marked a clearing. "This is it," Min said. "Their current base. You'll find cages, records, dogs that haven't seen sunlight in weeks." Luke stared at the map. The paper shook slightly in his hands. It wasn't just about Ash and Flicker anymore. He folded the map, tucked it into his jacket, and stood. "I'll get help," he said. "You're coming with me." But Min shook his head, slumping back. "I'm not going far. I just need water." "Rest. You go." "Do what I couldn't." Luke hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll come back." As he turned to leave, Flicker raised his head and looked at Luke with wide, amber eyes. Eyes that held no fear now, only something close to understanding. Back at the cabin, Luke stood over his desk map, unfolded, phone in hand. When the call connected, a familiar voice answered, laced with weariness. "Agent Nina Carter." Luke spoke with clarity and resolve. "I found someone. One of the handlers. And I know exactly where the compound is." He didn't wait for questions. The forest outside rustled in the wind. And somewhere beyond the trees and the silence, something darker still waited. The cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of stillness Luke had once sought, like a balm for old wounds. This silence felt heavier, sharper, like the breath held before a storm. The folded map sat on the wooden desk in front of him, its creases deep and worn ink slightly smudged from the moisture in Min's trailer. The X drawn near the edge of a ridgeline burned into his vision, a mark not just on paper but on the landscape of every memory he had tried to bury. Flicker was curled beside his chair, a warm, steady weight resting against Luke's boot. The pup had grown bolder in recent days, still shy, still prone to flinching at loud sounds or sudden movement. But now he followed Luke from room to room, ears twitching, eyes constantly searching for reassurance. Ash lay a few feet away, near the door, his gaze fixed on the window body, alert. Even in rest, he stood guard. Luke looked at them both. They weren't just survivors. They were signals. Messengers from a past he thought had died with the closing of old files, the loss of old comrades, the fading of old wars. But here they were, living proof that something he once fought against still moved quietly in the shadows. He reached for the phone. It had been years since he'd spoken to anyone at the Bureau. Years since his name had passed across desks or surfaced in the kinds of briefings that left out names but kept scars. He scrolled to the contact he never deleted, Agent Nina Carter, and stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering over the call button. Flicker stirred against his boot, letting out a soft, almost inaudible sigh. Luke looked down, and in that small breath, so simple, so trusting, he found his answer. He pressed call. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it connected. A crisp, professional voice came through. "Carter." Luke cleared his throat. "It's Luke Maddox." A pause. He could feel her drawing back into memory. "Maddox," she said carefully. "You're a hard man to track these days." "I like it that way," he replied. "I assume this isn't a social call. It's about Redline." Silence stretched for a beat. Then her tone shifted. "That's a closed case." "No," Luke said quietly. "It's not." He didn't waste time. He told her about the 2 pups he found in the storm, about the rusted chains, about the man in the trailer, Min, and his connection to the facility, and finally about the map. A hand-drawn set of directions leading deep into the unmonitored forests just west of the ridge, where fences and flashlights weren't supposed to exist anymore. When he finished, she exhaled audibly. "That's a lot, Maddox," she said. "And none of it verifiable. No digital evidence, no coordinates on a grid. Just paper, just words." "Min's real," Luke said. "He's wounded, dehydrated, but alive. And the dogs, they're marked. You can scan them. Tattoo under the ear. It matches Redline records. I'll need to send someone to confirm. You don't have time." He said it without force. Just truth. Carter didn't answer right away. Luke could hear the rustle of papers, the low murmur of voices on another line. Then she returned, voice low and serious. "If I open this door, it's under conditions. Luke nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "You will not be armed," she said. "You're not FBI. You're not military anymore." "Understood. But you know that terrain better than anyone. You'll guide us." "And the dogs," Luke added. That gave her pause. "The dogs? They'll find the trail," Luke said, "better than we will." Another silence. "Then, if anything feels off, we pull back." Luke's voice was steel. "No one's pulling back." There was a soft click as Carter hung up. Luke stared at the phone, the weight of everything pressing into his ribs. Behind him, the fire crackled low. Outside wind moved through the trees like whispers returning from the dark. He looked at Ash and Flicker. "This is happening," he said. Ash stood and walked toward him, ears tilted, eyes steady. Flicker climbed to his feet, legs still uncertain, but determination blooming behind the nervousness in his gaze. Luke knelt beside them both, one hand resting on each of their shoulders. "We're going to finish what someone else tried to bury." The rendezvous point was deep in the forest, accessible only by a narrow trail that twisted through gullies and old hunting paths now reclaimed by roots and moss. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon when the convoy of black SUVs pulled into the clearing. The sky was moonless, the stars hidden behind a veil of low clouds, casting the entire scene in the dim wash of tactical red flashlights and the occasional glint of metal against bark. Luke stood beside Ash and Flicker as the team emerged, 8 agents in black fatigues movements, silent and practiced, each carrying compact gear and scanning the perimeter with quiet precision. At their center stood Nina Carter. She was taller than he remembered, or perhaps she had just grown into the weight of command. Her hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her eyes carried that same unreadable intensity he had once admired. "Luke," she said simply. "Nina." She looked down at the dogs. "So these are our guides?" Luke nodded. "They know the way." She didn't question it. She simply turned, raised her hand, and gestured for the team to move. The group fell into a line, footsteps muffled by pine needles and loam. Luke walked near the front, Ash at his side. Flicker a few steps behind, weaving occasionally between boots, with a nervous energy that seemed to fade with every step deeper into the woods. The air was still. No wind, no birds, only the quiet crunch of their progress and the occasional crack of a twig beneath carefully placed feet. Half an hour in, Ash froze. His body stiffened, ears forward, tail low. Luke halted, raised his fist. The team stopped behind him instantly, weapons low but ready. Ash turned sharply to the left, toward what looked like a thick wall of ferns and brambles. Flicker let out a small whine. Luke stepped forward, parting the foliage. Behind it, nearly invisible from the trail, was a narrow cut in the earth, a slope descending gently into darkness, walls lined with stone and root. He glanced back at Carter, who gave a single nod. They descended. The trail wound down until it opened into a clearing, a flattened basin surrounded by trees that seemed almost too tall, too dense, as if nature herself was trying to keep the place hidden. And there at the center stood the compound, a scatter of low metal buildings, dull gray and windowless. Chain-link fences looped around the perimeter, topped with barbed wire gates sealed with heavy padlocks. Dim lights glowed from mounted posts, powered by a generator that hummed like an insect. But it was the sound beneath the hum that tore through the silence. Whimpers, high-pitched, muffled, dozens of them. Luke felt something coil tight in his chest. "They're here," he whispered. Carter gave the signal. The team moved. Within seconds, agents swept toward the gates, bolt cutters snapping through locks, silent entries breached with swift, controlled force. Shouts rose low, authoritative. Men ran from the buildings, surprised, scrambling. They were tackled, cuffed, dragged out into the dirt. And Luke. He didn't wait for orders. He sprinted toward the largest building, a long rectangle of rusted metal that reeked of urine and bleach. Ash and Flicker followed without hesitation. The door gave under his shoulders, swinging open with a groan. Inside was darkness, and cages. Rows of them, stacked, cramped, barely large enough for the trembling forms inside. Puppies, grown dogs, muzzles crusted with drool, eyes wide with fear. Some didn't even lift their heads, too weak to move. Luke didn't speak. He dropped to his knees, bolt cutters in hand. One by one, he snapped the locks. One by one, Ash and Flicker moved down the aisles, noses pressed to bars, tail low, guiding Luke to the corners, hidden in shadow. They weren't searching for threats. They were finding their own. Brothers, sisters, survivors. Luke opened the final cage and stepped back as a trembling beagle mix crawled forward, blinking at the sudden space. The pup paused, looked up at Luke with haunted eyes, and then cautiously stepped into freedom. Ash stood beside Luke, and for the first time since this began, Luke exhaled. Outside, voices called for medics. Flashlights flickered. The wind shifted. Carter approached him as he stepped back into the night. "We got everything," she said. "Documents, cameras, dogs, and the men who ran it." Luke didn't answer right away. He looked down at Ash and Flicker, then back at the compound, now surrounded by agents and headlights. He whispered, "This place is done." Carter nodded. "Because of you." Luke shook his head. "No," he said, "because they came back." And as the first hints of dawn touched the treetops, something inside Luke settled for the first time in years, not in silence or survival, but in purpose. And in the faces of the rescued, he saw a path that hadn't yet ended, only just begun. The night was the kind that held its breath, deep, still, and untouched by starlight. The clouds above stretched thick and low like a heavy curtain drawn across the sky, swallowing every glimmer of the moon. Beneath that cloak of darkness, the forest became a deeper shadow, and within it the team moved, silent figures weaving between trunks, boots pressing gently into the moss-carpeted ground, breaths drawn slow and steady. Luke led them just behind the point man, eyes narrowed to the pale outlines of the trail ahead. He didn't need light. The trees were familiar now. Their silence, once lonely, had become something else, something he could read. Ash walked just ahead of him, shoulders squared, body low, every step calculated. Flicker flanked his right, still smaller and more cautious, but focused his gaze flicking between Luke's feet and the shifting dark beyond the trees. Neither one hesitated. Not now. Not anymore. The air carried the damp scent of earth and pine. But underneath it, a sharper note lingered, metal oil, the faint stink of waste and fear. Luke knew that smell. It was the same that clung to cages, to blood-stained kennels, to the back rooms of places built to break spirits. They were getting close. He could feel it. He turned briefly, catching Carter's silhouette through the trees. She gave a small signal, 2 fingers forward, 1 down. Advance. Drop low. The line of agents rippled in response, sinking into the brush like ink through water. The forest seemed to tighten around them as they crept forward, the tension stretching breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. And then through the branches ahead, Luke saw it. A dull yellow glow, artificial and sickly, spilling from high-mounted floodlights that buzzed faintly against the cold night. The lights cast long, warped shadows across a clearing of hard-packed dirt. At its center stood the red line compound, just as Min's map had promised. Metal buildings squatted low to the ground, like waiting predators. Chain-link fencing enclosed the area, topped with thick coils of barbed wire. Every gate was padlocked. The hum of a generator droned faintly, and somewhere beneath it all came the softest, most heartbreaking sound Luke had ever heard. A whimper. One. Then another. Dozens. He crouched lower, fists clenched around the bolt cutters slung across his back. Ash froze ahead of him, one paw lifted, ears forward. Flicker pressed closer, his muscles trembling, but not in fear. Not anymore. In readiness. Carter moved beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "This is it." Luke nodded once. "They're waiting." She gave the signal. The team fanned out, surrounding the perimeter in practiced silence. 2 agents broke off toward the generator. Another pair circled to the rear where a gap in the fence previously patched with bent metal offered a quieter entry. Luke didn't move yet. He kept his eyes on Ash and Flicker. Ash stared straight at the gate, unmoving. Flicker's ears twitched. Then they both looked at Luke. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled through his nose, the cold stinging his throat. The world stilled. And then a low pop from the rear fence. The lights flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the compound. In the same breath, Carter moved. Her team surged forward like a wave of shadow, breaching the main gate with a flash of movement and muffled metal clanks. No flashbangs, no shouting, no noise, just precision. Luke followed them, in his steps fast, eyes adjusting quickly to the gloom. The buildings loomed on either side, their metal walls cold and slick with dew. Doors swung open. Men inside shouted, caught mid-step confusion, spreading faster than their alarm. Within seconds they were subdued, pushed to the ground, hands bound, questions hissed into their ears in sharp, practiced tones. But Luke wasn't looking for them. He was listening. The whimpers had grown louder now. Ash took the lead, turning sharply toward a long building at the back of the compound. Luke followed, heart-pounding, every footstep echoing in his bones. Flicker darted ahead, nose pressed low to the ground, tail down, but steady. They reached the heavy steel door. Locked. Luke pulled the bolt cutters from his back. The snap of metal echoed in the narrow corridor. The door creaked open, and inside the smell hit first. Stale air heavy with ammonia and waste. The thick, suffocating stench of neglect. Then came the sound. Dozens of tiny whimpers, some sharp, some barely audible, all filled with a kind of pleading Luke would never forget. Rows of cages lined the room, low, rusted, stacked 3 high. Inside were dogs of all sizes. Some pups no older than Flicker when he'd first been found. Others, older, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Some barked hoarsely. Others didn't move at all. Luke froze in the doorway. Then he dropped to his knees. He opened the first cage. A small shepherd pup crawled out, belly low, ears flattened. It didn't run. It simply pressed itself against his leg, trembling. Ash stood beside him, and without a word, Luke began to open the cages, one by one. Snap, open, whisper, guide. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. Ash and Flicker moved with him, weaving between cages, nosing into corners, alerting him to those who hadn't found the strength to whine. Flicker pawed at a cage half hidden under a broken table. Luke opened it. Inside, a tiny brown mixed breed curled up tightly, too weak to lift its head. Luke reached in, gathered it carefully in his arms. "You're safe," he whispered. Behind him, an agent entered. "Main area secure. 5 suspects detained. Carter wants confirmation on evidence." Luke gestured toward the rows of cages. "You're standing in it." The agent hesitated, then pulled out a camera, began snapping photos, dog by dog, cage by cage. Luke stepped into the next row. Ash barked softly. Not loud, just once, but urgent. Luke turned to see Ash standing at the far end, tail stiff, ears focused. Flicker was beside him, whining, pawing at a low metal panel in the wall. Luke rushed over, dropping to his knees. There was no handle. Just a small indentation, as if a door once meant to be hidden had settled there long ago. He pried it open with the tip of the bolt cutters. Behind it in the narrow crawl space was a hidden cage. Inside a single pup, black-coated, eyes wide, no collar, a number tattooed crudely into its leg. It didn't move, didn't cry, just stared. Luke reached in hand, trembling slightly, and gently pulled the pup free. It was bone-thin, its ribs sharp beneath skin. One paw was swollen. Luke cradled it against his chest. The pup didn't resist. Flicker moved beside him, nose pressed to the pup's flank. Ash leaned in too, brushing his head gently beneath the pup's jaw. The three of them stood like that for a breath, for a beat, for a lifetime folded into seconds. Then Luke turned toward the doorway. "We're done here," he said. He walked out into the night. Carter stood in the clearing, her face streaked with dirt, eyes bright in the shadows. "Did you find them all?" Luke nodded. "Enough. Ambulances were arriving now." Lights dimmed, engines low, blankets, water, open hands. Ash and Flicker stood at Luke's side, chests rising in sync, eyes no longer watching the trees but watching the future. And in that clearing beneath a sky still absent of moonlight, they didn't feel small anymore. They felt like a beginning. Because in the darkest night, it wasn't the stars that led them. It was each other. The wind shifted just as Luke stepped into the second kennel building, a low gust slipping through the fractured seams in the metal roof, carrying with it the stale, suffocating scent of decay and desperation. The kind of smell that didn't just sit in the nose, it settled in the chest. He paused in the doorway, blinking against the gloom, eyes slowly adjusting to the shadows that pressed inward from every side. Ash moved ahead of him, shoulders taut, his steps soundless over the cracked concrete floor. Flicker stayed close, nose twitching, ears flattening slightly at the layered symphony of sound that filled the space. Not barking, not growling, but something else. Soft scratching, thin trembling whines, the sound of paws against metal, of breath held too long, of life waiting. Luke's hand tightened around the bolt cutters slung over his shoulder. His heartbeat echoed loud in his ears, not from fear, but from a rising urgency that churned with every breath of that stagnant air. These cages weren't just holding animals. They were holding silence, grief, and the weight of being forgotten. He stepped forward. The cages lined both walls, welded steel bars gone dull with rust, latches sealed with padlocks. Straw bedding turned dark with urine and cold. Some were empty, but most were not. Inside the first cage, a small golden retriever pup huddled in the far corner, pressed flat against the wall, tail tucked so tightly it quivered under its belly. Its eyes, clouded by the dim, found Luke's as he approached, but it didn't move. Just stared, frozen, as if unsure whether this moment was rescue or another version of punishment. Luke dropped to his knee, heart hammering. "It's okay," he whispered. Not because he expected the pup to understand the words, but because saying them made the air feel different, less cruel, more human. The bolt cutter hissed softly as he set the blades around the padlock. Click. The lock fell. The door creaked open, and the retriever didn't move. Flicker padded forward, his nose reaching through the open bars. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply touched his nose to the pup's shoulder and waited. A beat passed, then another, and then barely a shift. A paw moved. The pup blinked. Flicker stepped back, and the retriever followed. One step, two. Into the open. Luke reached out but let his hand hover, letting the pup come closer on its own. When the little dog finally leaned into his palm, the feeling of ribs and fur and fragility grounded him in a way he couldn't explain. Behind him, Ash had already moved on toward the next cage, and then the next. Luke stood. The rhythm began. Cut, open, wait. whisper, guide, and always, Ash and Flicker were just ahead. Ash scanned corners, pausing in front of cages that looked empty, but held small bodies curled in shadow. Flicker nosed at rusted hinges, drawing Luke's attention to locks nearly fused shut from age and neglect. Some dogs cried when freed. Some didn't make a sound. A few licked Luke's hands as they stepped into the open. Others cowered, unwilling to leave without coaxing. But none of them resisted. They all came, one by one, a breath at a time, a cage at a time. Luke lost track of how many. His knees ached from crouching. His palms burned from metal, but he kept going. Because each snap of a lock wasn't just metal giving way. It was the sound of something returning dignity, hope, the simple truth that no creature should be born just to be forgotten. In one far corner, hidden behind a stack of broken crates, Ash stopped. His body went still, ears forward, tail low, head tilted. Luke followed, brushing aside the crates. Behind them, pressed between the wall and an old feed bin, was a single cage smaller than the rest, with a broken hinge and a chain instead of a padlock. It was almost invisible in the dark. Ash gave a low, steady rumble. Not a growl, more like a hum, a vibration of awareness. Luke crouched and peered inside. At first he thought it was empty. Then he saw it. A puppy no older than a few weeks curled tightly into the corner. Its fur a dull slate-gray eyes, shut chest, moving so faintly, Luke had to lean closer to be sure it was breathing. He reached for the chain and carefully unthreaded it. The door squealed open. Ash sat down beside him, watching unmoving. Luke reached in and scooped the pup into his arms, cradling it against his chest. It was limp but warm, breathing but faint. Flicker stepped forward and pressed his nose against the pup's ear, then nuzzled beneath its chin gently like a brother who knew the language of quiet. Luke turned, carried the pup to a blanket laid out near the building entrance, and wrapped it tightly. He looked back at Ash. Ash looked at the next row of cages, and so they continued. Cut, open, wait, whisper, guide. Some cages were stacked too high. Luke needed help lifting the doors. One agent entered quietly and joined him, kneeling beside cages, offering gentle hands. Carter herself stepped in later, her voice steady as she logged the count. 37 dogs, 37 lives, and every one of them is breathing. When the last cage creaked open, when the final pup stepped into the dim light of freedom, the air in the building shifted. It felt different. Lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Luke leaned back against one of the support beams, sweat clinging to his shirt hands stained with rust and dust. Ash sat beside him, eyes scanning the room. Flicker lay curled next to the gray pup they'd found in the back nose, tucked beneath its ear, as if refusing to leave it behind for even a second. Luke looked around. So many of the dogs were still quiet. Not broken, just waiting. Processing what freedom meant. Some wagged their tails. Some licked water from offered bowls. Others simply sat heads low, watching everything unfold. But every single cage was open. Every breath was free. Carter stepped up beside him. "You did good," she said softly. Luke didn't answer. He just looked at Ash, at Flicker, and at the sea of blinking eyes around him. "No," he whispered finally. They did, and in the quiet that followed, the wind moved again through the trees, brushing against the walls, as if the forest itself had stopped to listen. Because inside this place where pain once echoed off steel, there was a different sound now. The sound of 37 cages, no longer holding prisoners. The sound of 37 hearts beating in unison. The sound of breath returning. The morning arrived, not in brilliance, but in a soft hush, the kind that comes after the sky has cried for too long, and finally allows itself a moment to rest. Mist clung to the treetops like a breath held too gently, and the sun broke through in slivers, casting long streaks of gold between the branches touching the ground, as if in apology. Inside the clearing, the rescue effort had settled into quiet motion. No more shouting. No more doors kicked in. Just the sound of soft footsteps, the rustle of blankets, the creak of cages being folded down and set aside. And everywhere pause. Dozens of them. Stepping, staggering, pausing. The dogs moved like they were relearning the world. Some sniffed the wind. Some clung tightly to the legs of those who fed them. Others simply lay in the morning light, soaking it into their skin like warmth they never thought they'd feel again. Luke stood near the tree line, arms crossed, his back straight despite the ache creeping across his shoulders. Dirt streaked his sleeves and his hands bore the smudges of rust and fur and something harder to name. But in his eyes, just beneath the fatigue, was something clear and whole, like glass warmed by the sun. Ash sat at his left, steady and grounded. Flicker flanked his right tail, brushing gently against his boot with every nervous wag. Across the clearing, a volunteer from the local animal rescue approached one of the mobile units, a soft blue transport van with mesh windows and a ramp built into the back. She knelt beside an open crate, coaxing a young pup forward. It was a small dog, its curly coat puffed unevenly with patches of grime and missing fur. Its body trembled, but not from cold. The pup hesitated, then looked around at the van, at the people, at the unfamiliar vastness of sky. And then it looked at Flicker. Their eyes met. Flicker stood, his legs stiff, head tilted just slightly. He stepped forward, slow and careful, his ears still low, but his movement certain. The curly-haired pup took one hesitant step out of the crate, then another. And when Flicker reached him, he didn't bark, didn't sniff. He simply lowered his head and touched his nose gently to the other pup's muzzle, a soft, fleeting nudge, as if to say, "I see you. I know where you've been." Luke watched, breath caught. That tiny gesture held more weight than any order ever barked in combat, any command ever shouted on a field. It was quiet, tender, sacred. The curly pup blinked once, then walked forward on its own tail, twitching paws rising more surely with each step. Luke felt something stirred deep inside him. Not sorrow, not guilt, but release. Ash, who had remained seated, turned his head slightly to watch. His eyes weren't scanning anymore. They weren't assessing threats or tracking motion. They were soft. For the first time Luke saw it, Ash was no longer braced, no longer carrying every second like armor. Something in him had shifted, eased, accepted. Luke reached down and rested a hand gently on Ash's head. "You see it too, don't you?" he murmured. Ash didn't move, but his breathing slowed. Another volunteer passed by with a puppy wrapped in a towel, whispering softly as she placed it into a crate filled with soft bedding. The pup curled up instantly, nose tucked beneath its paw. One by one, the dogs were being loaded onto the transports. The crates were padded and open, and each one had a name being written gently in marker on the tape along its side. Names. Flicker padded back to Luke's side eyes, still following the curly pup, now settled with two others near the back of the van. He leaned slightly against Luke's leg. Luke looked down at him, and for the first time, not just in thought or in feeling, but in voice, he said it aloud. "You're my family now." He looked at Ash. "You both are." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed quietly, folded themselves into the soil, the light, the breath between them. Ash looked up, eyes meeting Luke's, and this time there was no wariness. Only something ancient and enduring. Loyalty born not from training, but from trust freely given. A man from the bureau approached with a clipboard, nodding slightly as he glanced at the filled transport vans. 17 dogs cleared for adoption centers downstate. Another 11 headed to the shelter network. 9 are going directly into foster care. He looked at Luke. The last 2 Luke didn't answer immediately. He turned slightly, letting his gaze drift across the clearing. Ash stood beside him. Flicker pressed closer. Luke crouched down, one hand on each dog fingers, buried in fur that had grown thicker since that first rainstorm that night when everything had changed. He smiled, a small, tired thing that felt more like a beginning than an end. "They're not going anywhere." The man blinked. "You're keeping them?" Luke nodded. "I didn't find them," he said. "They found me." The agent scribbled something on his clipboard, but his face held a softness that didn't belong to protocol. He gave a quiet nod and moved on. Flicker watched him go, then turned to Luke, tail wagging once. Ash sat again, lifting his chin slightly, gaze steady on the horizon, where the trees gave way to light. Luke stood, hands in his pockets, eyes watching the final crates being closed. The last doors latched the ramps, folding gently back into place. The engine of the lead transport rumbled softly to life. Carter approached from behind him, her footsteps almost silent. "They'll be okay," she said, looking toward the vans. Luke nodded. "I know." "You could have walked away," she added, voice low. "I did," he said, once. She glanced at Ash and Flicker, and now Luke's gaze stayed on the clearing. "Now I walk with them." She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders relaxed. "Take care of them," she said. Luke turned to her, eyes steady. "They've taken care of me." The vans began to roll forward, tires crunching over pine needles and stone. The dogs inside, some sleeping, some watching, some pressing noses to mesh windows, moved farther from the place that had tried to erase them. And Luke felt it in his chest, like letting go of something that had never belonged in his hands to begin with. He raised a hand in quiet farewell. Not to the agents, not to Carter, but to the parts of himself he had lost, fragments now carried gently away in the form of soft paws and hopeful eyes. Flicker sat beside him, tongue hanging slightly, head tilted toward the receding vans. Ash stood tall, a quiet sentinel. And Luke, he breathed, deep and full, like a man who had finally stepped out from beneath the rubble of silence. The forest was beginning to fill with light, and though there was still much ahead, still memories to sort through, still healing to walk through, one thing was clear. They had not just been rescued. They had been chosen. Again. By each other. By something wordless and sacred. And as the last transport disappeared down the path, Flicker pressed closer. Ash gave a soft, steady breath, and Luke placed his hand over both of them. "We go home," he said. And for the first time in years, the word meant something more than shelter. It meant belonging. Winter had wrapped itself around the Oregon forest like a thick woolen blanket, quiet, unyielding, and deeply still. Snow dusted the evergreens outside, turning the tops of pines into pale silhouettes that shimmered faintly beneath the low silver light of a sun too tired to rise fully. The air held the kind of cold that crept into wood and stone, clung to windows, and silenced even the rivers, which now slumbered beneath their own frozen breath. But inside the cabin, the world glowed. The fire burned steady, its orange and gold reflection dancing against the knotty pine walls, casting shifting light across the floor. The smell of cedar smoke mingled with warm wool and faint traces of coffee. Near the hearth, 2 small bodies lay nestled together on a thick woven rug. Flicker curled tightly into himself, tail wrapped around his back legs, while Ash lay beside him, stretched out, chest rising slow and even with sleep. Luke sat in his chair nearby, one leg folded over the other, a thick sweater pulled close around his shoulders. His hands, no longer clenched from habit, rested easily in his lap. The journal sat on the table next to him, half open, a pen tucked in the crease, like a conversation paused mid-thought. He hadn't written much since the rescue. There hadn't been need. Some stories, he'd realized, wrote themselves in the silence. He leaned forward slightly, elbow resting on one knee, and watched Flicker twitch gently in his sleep. A paw, jerk a quiet sigh, ears flicking once before settling again. The sound of the fire shifted, then a sharp crack from a knot in the wood. Weeks ago, it would have sent Flicker's scurrying eyes wide-breath shallow. But tonight, the pup didn't even stir. He simply adjusted his position, nuzzled deeper into the soft folds of the blanket beneath him, and let out a breath that ended in a tiny snore. Luke smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just the kind that rose gently from somewhere deep, quiet, patient earned. He reached out and placed his hand gently on Ash's head. The dog's ears perked at the touch, but he didn't wake fully. He just opened one eye, blinked up at Luke, and then let it close again, as if to say, "I know it's you. I don't need to check anymore." Luke's voice was low, barely more than breath. "We've got each other now." The words hung in the air not as an epiphany, but as confirmation. A truth that had slowly taken shape in the steady rhythm of days filled with healing. The nightmares had dulled. The barking in sleep had faded. Flicker no longer flinched when doors closed. Ash no longer paced the cabin like a guard on endless patrol. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in slow, sweeping breaths. The snowfall had stopped, but the flakes that clung to the branches trembled loose now and then, drifting to the forest floor like forgotten wishes. Luke stood and crossed to the window. He pulled the thick curtain aside just a little, peering out into the pale world beyond. The moon had returned soft and fun, floating like a lantern above the treetops. Its light painted the snow in cool shades of silver and blue. He watched the shadows move, but they no longer unnerved him. The ghosts were quieter now. Not gone, not erased, but softer. There had been a time when the dark held nothing but echoes of orders, shouted in dust of boots moving toward gunfire, of the last confused breaths of dogs left behind. Those memories still stirred now and then. But tonight, as he stood with his palm resting lightly against the cold glass, Luke didn't brace for them. He simply watched. Because now in the corner of his eye, there were two forms by the firelight. Breathing. Present, whole. He stepped away from the window, poured himself a cup of tea from the kettle he'd left warming on the stove, and settled back into his chair. The warmth filled his hands, seeped up into his chest, and loosened the tightness in his shoulders. For a while he just sat in the quiet, letting the fire speak, letting the night pass gently. Flicker stirred eventually, his head lifting just enough to blink sleepily toward Luke. His tail gave a soft wag 1-2, then fell still again. He didn't move from Ash's side. Luke took a sip, leaned back, and stared into the flame. It reminded him of that first night. The rain, the chains, the way Flicker had shivered at every sound, the way Ash had watched without blinking, hiding his fear behind silence. They had been wreckage then, barely clinging to the edge of survival. But now they were warmth. Ash shifted in his sleep, pressing closer to Flicker, chin resting briefly on the pup's flank before sliding off with a lazy sigh. Luke reached over to the journal and opened it slowly. The blank page stared back at him. He picked up the pen, but didn't write immediately. He watched the way the firelight flickered across Ash's fur, how it shimmered across Flicker's soft white coat. And then finally he wrote December 19th. The wind is slow tonight. The fire is steady. Flicker didn't flinch when the log cracked. Ash hasn't checked the door once. We are home. He paused, letting the ink dry. And just as he was about to close the book, he added, I'm learning that peace doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like this quiet breathing, curled on a rug by the fire. A soft knock came then, unexpected, but not alarming. Luke set down the journal, rose, and moved to the door. When he opened it, a small package sat on the step. Wrapped in brown paper, no return address. Just a white tag with 3 words in clean handwriting, "For those who stayed." Luke bent, picked it up, turned it over in his hands. Inside, carefully wrapped, was a wooden picture frame handmade smooth with polish and care. Behind the glass was a photo Ash and Flicker, sleeping beside one another, their heads gently touching. Luke recognized the angle it was from the shelter's security camera on the night of the rescue. Someone had saved it. Beneath the photo was a single line chosen twice. Luke's breath caught. He carried the frame back inside, set it on the mantel above the fire, and stepped back. It fit there. Perfectly. Flicker stirred again this time, rising fully, stretching his back legs with a soft groan before walking to Luke's side. He leaned against his shin eyes, blinking slowly in the firelight. Luke knelt, ran his fingers through Flicker's fur. Ash came next, standing tall beside them both, head resting briefly against Luke's shoulder. They stood there for a long moment. The 3 of them. No past too sharp to speak of. No future too far to reach. Just now. Just here. Just each other. And in the warm glow of the hearth, with shadows dancing like stories across the walls, Luke whispered once more, not for reassurance, but for the pure truth of it. "We're safe now." Ash licked his hand once. Flicker let out a soft breath. And as the fire cracked and the wind moved gently through the trees, the cabin felt full of warmth, of stillness, of eyes that no longer scanned the dark for danger, but rested in the quiet certainty of being known. And outside, far beyond the frost and silence, somewhere past the whispering pines, a new season waited. The light that morning filtered through the cabin windows like a quiet blessing, soft, golden, and slow. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, catching on the worn edges of the books piled near the fireplace and the old wool blanket draped across the back of Luke's chair. Outside, frost still clung to the porch railings, delicate as lace, but inside the fire had been burning since dawn. The cabin was warm alive with small movements, the sound of paws stretching across floorboards, a yawn, a tail thumping gently against a rug. Ash lay by the door, regal as ever, eyes calm, always watching, but no longer wary. Flicker was curled beneath the windowsill, nose pressed against the glass, where his breath fogged the pane in soft bursts. He watched a squirrel dig into the frozen ground, tilting his head this way and that, as if trying to decipher the language of the forest. On the table, an old knotted slab of oak that had long served as a desk, a dinner surface, and a place for folded maps, stood a picture frame. Simple, wooden, carefully polished. Inside was a certificate. Certificate of official adoption. Flicker and Ash, adopted by Luke Maddox, issued by the Fair Harbor Animal Rescue Coalition. Beneath the printed words, Clara Voss's signature curved gently, her neat handwriting like a steady hand on a stormy sea. And below that, 2 paw prints, one darker, heavier, belonging to Ash. The other smaller, more delicate Flicker's. Luke stared at it every morning now. Not as a reminder of what had been taken, but of what had been chosen. That framed paper didn't just mark a legal decision. It marked a promise. And like all promises that meant something, it came with responsibility. That responsibility had taken form just 3 weeks after the rescue. Luke had driven into Fair Harbor, Ash and Flicker in tow, both leaning against the truck windows as if sensing they were part of something larger than themselves. The town's veterinary office had looked the same, peeling trim the ceramic shepherd still perched on the porch rail. But that day, something was different. Luke had walked inside and placed an envelope on Clara's desk. She hadn't opened it at first, just stared at him, her expression unreadable. "What's this?" she asked. Luke answered with the kind of clarity that came from weeks of silence and thought. "It's everything I have left." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Luke, I want to start something." He interrupted, his voice steady. "Not for me, for them." She looked at Ash, seated at Luke's side like a soldier awaiting orders, and at Flicker, whose tail wagged once when she met his eyes. "Paulite," Luke said softly. "That's what I want to call it." Clara opened the envelope, then her fingers moving slowly, as if she already understood what was inside. A check. A letter. A plan sketched out in a hand, rough from years of work, but steady. "A foundation?" she asked. "A lifeline," Luke replied. "For dogs like them. Discarded, overused, forgotten." Clara had said nothing for a long time. Then she stood and walked to the back office. When she returned, she placed a small cardboard box on the desk and opened it. Inside were folders, photos, notes from cases she had never been able to close. Dogs with names, dogs without. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she said. And just like that, Paulite was born. They started small. Luke converted the old barn behind his cabin, cleaned out the tools laid down, straw rewired the lights. Clara contacted a retired behaviorist named Marvin from 2 counties over. Supplies came from donations, blankets from the local quilt circle, food from a nearby feed store that refused to charge them more than cost. And through it all, Ash and Flicker were there. They walked with the newcomers, shaking dogs brought in from shelters from broken homes, from the ruins of places like Redline. They taught without commands. They modeled stillness, trust, curiosity. Flicker curled beside those too scared to eat his warmth steady. Ash patrolled the perimeter at night, always returning to lay quietly outside each recovery pen as if to say, "You're safe now, I'll keep watch." Word spread slowly but surely. By the end of the 2nd month, they had placed 5 dogs into new homes. By spring, a dozen. And Luke? Luke found himself rising earlier, not from habit, but from hope. Each morning, after feeding the animals and checking the fencing, he'd return to the cabin, pour a mug of coffee, and sit at the oak table beneath that certificate. Sometimes he'd write updates for the Paulite newsletter, a modest collection of stories mostly printed and handed out by Clara at the farmer's market. Other times he simply stared at the frame and let the morning settle around him like a second skin. One day, just before dusk, a woman named Marie came to visit. She had seen one of Clara's flyers. She was quiet, her eyes heavy with something Luke recognized, loss that didn't know where to go. Her dog, a German shepherd named Odin, had passed 6 months earlier. He had been a therapy dog for her autistic son. Since then, her son had stopped speaking. Marie didn't come looking for a replacement. She came hoping to remember. Luke didn't try to sell her on anything. He simply introduced her to Flicker. The little pup walked forward slow and careful. He didn't leap, didn't demand, just stood at her feet and looked up. She sank to her knees and cried into his fur. Flicker leaned closer. Luke watched from the porch, and later that night he wrote in his journal, "Sometimes healing walks in on 4 paws, carrying no explanation, just presence." Ash curled beside him as he finished the sentence. Flicker lay in the next room, asleep on his back legs in the airtail, twitching with some unknown dream. The certificate still stood on the table, unmoved, unfaded. But deeper than the paper and ink was what it now represented. This was no longer just a story of survival. This was a story of rebuilding, of giving back, of 2 dogs who had once been left in the mud and the rain, now standing as quiet proof that love was not wasted on the broken. It was made for them. One afternoon, Clara arrived at the cabin holding a newspaper. She laid it gently on the table beside the frame. Luke looked down and saw a headline in bold. "From war zone to sanctuary, one man's fight to give forgotten dogs a second chance." Below it was a photo of Ash and Flicker side by side on the porch, wind blowing slightly through the trees behind them. Luke picked up the paper, read a few lines, then set it down. He didn't speak, but Clara smiled. "You don't need to say anything," she said. They already did. The fire cracked softly behind them. Outside, birds called to one another through the trees. And beneath the framed certificate, Ash rested his head on Flicker's back, both of them at ease, wrapped in the kind of stillness that only belongs to those who've survived the storm. Luke placed his hand over the glass fingers, tracing the words. Then he looked up, and in the warm amber light of the cabin, surrounded by the quiet hum of purpose, he understood this wasn't the end of their rescue. It was just the beginning of what they'd build from it. The road curved gently through meadows, dusted with spring, where green began reclaiming the edges of earth, long frozen. Luke drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the open window frame, the wind threading through his fingers like silk. Ash sat upright in the passenger seat, regal and alert, his gaze following the passing landscape with the steady watchfulness of someone who no longer expected harm, but still remembered how to recognize it. Flicker lay curled on the bench behind them, his soft snore barely audible over the hum of the tires and the breeze sliding through the cab. They had been on the road for 2 hours, heading to another rescue center in the outskirts of a town Luke barely remembered from his service years. Paw Light had been growing steadily, and Luke had agreed to meet with other groups, hoping to model their own sanctuaries on what he and Clara had built. He never liked speaking in public, but Flicker did. In a room full of strangers, the little dog would walk from one person to the next, ears down, tail wagging tentatively, leaning his warm body into shins and palms, and open hands that didn't know what they needed until they were touching him. Ash would stay close always, within a few feet, his presence like a still stone in a rushing river. People felt safer when he was near, even if they didn't understand why. They arrived just before noon. The building was modest white walls, a few runs fenced into a patch of soft grass posters on the windows. Luke parked under the shade of a tall pine. As he stepped out, Flicker leapt down after him with a bounce that still surprised Luke, and Ash exited with his usual calm, walking shoulder to thigh with Luke as they approached the front doors. Inside, volunteers and visitors gathered in a small circle of folding chairs. A table in the corner held juice coffee and a tray of brownies someone had labeled, "For humans only." Luke didn't need a name tag. Most already recognized him from the article Clara had quietly helped publish months ago. But the attention never lingered on him long, not when Ash stood so tall and quiet at his side, or when Flicker walked the room like a story waiting to be heard. A woman approached as they were being introduced to the rescue director. "Excuse me," she asked gently, kneeling to stroke Ash's chest. "Are they both service-trained?" Luke looked at her for a moment, then smiled, not from pride, but from something deeper. "They're not trained," he said. "They're Flicker and Ash." The woman blinked, confused for a second. But Luke didn't explain further, because that was the whole answer. Later that day, during a panel discussion on emotional support programs, Luke sat near the edge of the room, watching as children and teens from a nearby school arrived for a therapy visit. The rescue director had organized it as part of an outreach initiative. Flicker immediately moved toward them, his body low and his tail moving in soft, uncertain arcs. The children responded in waves. Some rushed to greet him, hands outstretched, laughter trailing behind their movements. Others hesitated. And one little girl, no more than 8, stood frozen near the back of the room. Her hair was tangled into a long braid, her hoodie sleeves pulled over clenched fists. She watched Flicker without smiling, her expression unreadable. Luke noticed. He said nothing. But Flicker saw her too. He paused mid-greeting, turned his head, and slowly walked toward her. Not directly. He arced wide, sniffing at chairs, brushing past tables, lowering his ears as he approached. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and lay down belly to the floor, chin between his paws, and waited. The girl blinked once, then twice. Finally, she took a step forward, knees bent, and she dropped to the floor. Luke watched from across the room as Flicker raised his head, letting her small hands wrap around his neck, fingers disappearing into the fur at his chest. She buried her face against him and didn't speak for a long time. And then Luke saw her lips move, a whisper, barely formed. He stepped closer, kneeling beside them without a word. The girl turned her head slightly and looked at him, not afraid, not uncertain, just present. "I used to be like the dogs," she said. "Locked up, quiet." Luke didn't answer with words. He only placed a gentle hand on Flicker's back and let the silence do what it needed to do. When she stood a few minutes later, her eyes were wet, but her shoulders had relaxed. She looked at Luke. "Is he yours?" Luke met her gaze and after a pause nodded once. "Yes. And I'm his." She gave a soft smile, wiped her nose on her sleeve, and walked back to her classmates. Flicker remained where he was, tail thumping once eyes closed. Ash joined him moments later, standing behind, watching the girl go. Luke sat between them, resting a hand on each of their backs. He didn't feel like their owner, or even their rescuer. He felt like something quieter, a witness. A keeper of stories that could only be told through closeness, through breath, through presence. That night back at the cabin, Luke sat at the wooden table, the adoption certificate catching the firelight in faint gold glimmers. The journal was open, and his pen moved slowly. March 3rd. Today a child taught me how courage doesn't always make a sound. Sometimes it wraps itself around a dog's neck and whispers me too. He looked over at the fireplace. Ash lay stretched out on the rug, his breathing deep, his eyes half-lidded but still tracking every movement Luke made. Flicker was curled beneath the table head, resting on Luke's foot. Luke set down the pen and leaned back in his chair. He'd always imagined that fatherhood looked like words spoken over dinner tables. Advice handed out like folded paper notes, a title earned through years. But this was something else. This was learning how to say nothing at all. This was waking in the middle of the night because Flicker had whimpered once in a dream and kneeling beside him until the breathing evened out again. This was watching Ash walk the perimeter of the barn after dusk, then return, lay down, and finally let go of his vigilance. This was a kind of fatherhood without structure, without ceremony. He hadn't raised them, but they had raised something in him he thought long dead. And they never called him Dad. They didn't need to. He was the one who showed up. He was the one who stayed. And that Luke had come to understand was the loudest love of all. In the morning, they would drive again to another shelter, another town, another group of people who didn't yet know how much they needed to sit with silence and watch two dogs walk slowly toward them and say without a single bark, "You're not alone." But for now, Luke rose, placed a blanket gently over Flicker's back, and stood at the window. The forest was dark, but not foreboding. The moon peeked through clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked once and was gone. Ash lifted his head. Luke nodded to him. The dog laid it back down. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life built not from rescue, but from choosing to stay, Luke understood that family was never something you claimed. It was something you became, even without a name. The forest awoke in quiet celebration. Green unfurled from every branch like a whispered promise. Soft moss crept over the edges of roots and stone, and small wildflowers stretched beneath the canopy of light that filtered through in golden strands. The air carried that delicate scent of earth after thaw of pine and sun-warmed bark of water trickling through creek beds once frozen in silence. Spring had returned to Oregon, not as a sudden blaze, but as a steady breath, long and patient. The cabin sat nestled in that hush, its wooden frame warmed by days of sunlight and its porch washed clean by soft rain from a week before. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, not out of need, but from habit, a gesture of comfort more than survival. Luke sat on the front steps, elbows resting on his knees, a chipped ceramic mug in his hand. The coffee inside had gone cold, but he hadn't moved in a while. Not because he was tired, just still. Before him, the clearing was alive. Ash leapt into the air, catching the faded yellow ball with precise grace paws folding beneath him, mid-flight before landing in a soft roll on the grass. Flicker barked once high-pitched, sharp with joy, and spun in a wild circle, tail wagging as if he were a flame catching wind. He didn't care who had the ball. For him, the game was everything. The movement, the sound, the thrill of being part of something that echoed laughter without needing to be taught how. Luke smiled, watching them, with a kind of warmth that settled deep below the ribs, where once there had only been a hollow place no one talked about. Ash trotted back with the ball, dropped it gently near Luke's boot, and sat down, his chest, proud ears, alert tail brushing the grass in slow, satisfied sweeps. Luke picked up the ball again, weighing it in his palm. The once bright rubber was dulled teeth marks etched across its surface, but it still bounced true. With an easy flick of his wrist, he sent it sailing again, high-arcing through sunlight. Ash ran. Flicker ran too, though he never chased the ball. He chased with it, around it, beside it, as if joy itself were something he could outrun just long enough to keep it alive. Luke leaned back on his palms, letting the light warm his face. The sounds around him were simple. The rustle of undergrowth, the thud of paws on grass, the sharp panting of two dogs who had forgotten what it meant to be afraid. Somewhere a bird called once then again. The wind played gently through the trees. No sirens. No orders barked through static radios. No boots crunching behind his back. Just this. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were still there. Ash now lying in the shade, head on crossed paws, watching the horizon as if guarding something sacred. Flicker flopped belly up near the steps, tongue-lolling tail, flicking like a metronome of delight. Luke set the empty mug beside him and reached down to rub behind Flicker's ears. "You remember," he said softly, voice barely above the wind, "when I found you?" Flicker made a contented noise in his throat. Ash glanced over. Luke smiled. "Of course you do. You always knew exactly what you were surviving." He wasn't sure if he was talking to them or to himself anymore. Maybe both. Because it had started with a sound. A whimper in the rain. Two small bodies too cold to cry loud. A strip of forest that once meant nothing more than an obstacle on a map. And now... Luke looked at the cabin behind him. The windows were open. Inside, the wood floor was polished by use. There were two bowls beside the hearth, a stack of folded blankets on the bench, and a dent in the pillow, where Flicker sometimes curled during storms. Clara had visited a few days ago, bringing fresh medical supplies and stories from the Paulite Center. The new expansion was underway. More dogs were arriving. Families were waiting. And in the center of it all stood two silent mascots. Flicker, Ash. Not because of their obedience. Not because of their training. But because of who they had become, unbreakable. Not through force, but through tenderness rediscovered. Luke rose and stepped down into the grass, walking between them. Ash stood and followed. Flicker bounded ahead. They wandered through the trees for a while, as they often did. Past the creek that now ran clear. Past the stump where Flicker once sat and howled during his first storm. Past the hollow where Ash had once curled up, back turned, unwilling to come closer, until Luke simply sat nearby and waited. And waited. Until the silence became trust. They reached a grove where bluebells now grew. Ash nosed through them, careful not to crush their petals. Flicker chased a moth. Luke knelt and traced his fingers over a mark carved into bark. An old military tag he'd once etched there during a lonely patrol long before he ever knew what he was missing. Now, he touched it like a relic. And then he carved below it, Flicker and Ash home, It wasn't a monument. It was a note, a memory for the forest. On the walk back, the light softened. Shadows stretched long golden through the trees. Flicker fell into rhythm beside him. Ash took rear guard as always, and Luke once, a man built for distance, now walked with the steady gait of someone who had found his place and wasn't leaving again. Back at the cabin, he lit the lanterns early, not out of need, but because their glow looked beautiful in the windows. He cooked dinner with 2 sets of eyes, watching his every move, noses twitching as he sliced, stirred, and hummed tunelessly. They didn't beg. They never had. But when he set the bowls down beside the hearth, Flicker did a twirl before eating, and Ash nudged Luke's calf as if to say thank you in a language far older than words. Later, they curled up together on the porch. Luke leaned against the post, a blanket across his knees. Flicker lay pressed against his hip, breathing slow and deep. Ash rested at his feet, tail curled around himself. Above them, the stars emerged one by one. He looked up and let them arrive. Not searching for anything, just receiving. People thought you weren't worth saving, he said softly. But now. He looked down. You're what saves me. Flicker stirred in his sleep. Ash shifted closer. Luke closed his eyes. Somewhere in another part of the country, dogs were still waiting behind fences. Still learning how to stop flinching. Still trying to understand that voices didn't always mean pain. Pawlight would reach them, one by one. Luke had promised that. And he had kept every promise since the day he followed a sound through the rain and found 2 beings too small to carry that kind of silence. Now their silence was different. Full, whole, a presence instead of an absence. He smiled to himself, eyes still closed. Spring was here. The forest was listening. The cabin would always have room. And under the hum of night beneath a sky stitched with stars, only 3 sounds remained. A breath, a heartbeat, and the soft padding of paws chasing something beautiful through the dark.